Hi, my name is Jake Greenspan. I am the director of the Floortime Center, a Greenspan Floortime Approach licensed trainer, as well as the son of Dr. Stanley Greenspan. My father, Dr. Greenspan, was fairly adamant about necessary components of Greenspan Floortime in order to call it such. This still applies when doing online therapy and learning. Certainly, we may be able to loosen the rules a little bit so that we can apply them to effectively a new environment. However, it is important we don't stretch the rules too much. In a previous lecture, I discussed the non-negotiable elements of what constitutes the Greenspan Floortime approach and what techniques and principles Dr. Greenspan always infused into his programs to make sure he got the highest quality long-term results with the families he worked with. These non-negotiable elements are still true and can be modified and adjusted in order to be integrated into online teletherapy. That being said, online teletherapy should not be done if it is not absolutely necessary. All children need real-time, three-dimensional social exchanges and interactions. Looking at a screen is different than looking at a face in real life. It is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object. You're going to see less subtlety if you're looking at a face on the screen versus in real life. Also, a child has more options of how to interact and communicate with you in real life versus virtually. So it's important, again, we remember that this is not a replacement, it is a temporary substitute. It's also important to note that many of these principles and non-negotiable components I'm about to share with you are more applicable to children who are working on milestones 5 and 6 and up, meaning that children who have some language, who are really able to stay organized, focused, and attentive to social interactions, i.e., they've decently mastered the fourth milestone of shared social problem solving and especially the continuous flow, will allow them to attend and interact for longer periods of time with less sensory and emotional stimulation and feedback being provided as may be necessary with online therapy. This means that for some of the younger children or children with greater developmental needs, i.e. working on some of the earlier developmental milestones like still mastering shared attention, engagement, two-way interaction, as well as the basics of problem solving, continuous flow, we should be focusing on caregiver-child interactions at home by providing them with more support activities and ideas and doing coaching and consulting versus trying to doing direct therapy ourselves. That's not to say there aren't ways in which we can achieve some therapeutic benefit from teletherapy with these children. However, it will need to be more heavily balanced and put in the hands of the caregivers and family at home. But isn't that how floor time or the Greenspan floor time approach should be done anyways? The answer is yes. The Greenspan DR model and the Greenspan floor time approach are two different things. I stress this in many of my lectures because unfortunately, even to the day, even in emails from other organizations, you still see people saying they use DIR. Well, yes, you can use DIR to evaluate children and set goals, but you do not use DIR as an intervention. It is a model used to evaluate children, set goals, and understand a child's developmental profile. Its intended use is to help us understand a child's regulatory profile, meaning how do they take in and respond to the sensory and the emotional world around them. This will impact their ability to progress through the Greenspan DIR milestones or stages, however you refer to them. These are the 6 basic milestones as well as the 3 more advanced ones, and help us identify how we can build and deepen the meaningful relationships in our lives and the importance of those relationships for learning from the world around us. This is what Dr. Greenspan developed the DIR model or the Greenspan DR model to do. So again, you can see from its fundamental definition that it is not an intervention meant to be integrated into therapy. It is a set of goals and a model that helps us understand children and adolescents, teenagers, and adults. The Greenspan floor time approach, which is Dr. Greenspan's version of floor time, is an intervention supported by the science of neuroplasticity to help all children achieve optimal developmental growth and social emotional health. So this is where we start getting into techniques. This is when we start getting into principles. It is the Greenspan floor time approach, or floor time, as people generically call it, that will give us our tools and help guide our standards of practice of how we can be integrating this into a online therapy model as well as at home. The Greenspan DR model will give us our goals and help parents and professionals understand what they should be working on. And the Greenspan floor time approach is the set of techniques and principles that help us guide the intervention in order to achieve those goals. Please remember, anybody who says they do DIR or they use DIR as an intervention does not have the proper information, and you should question their application, because what it means most of the time is while they have the right goals, they are definitively not going to be using Dr. Greenspan's methods. For online teletherapy, here are 3 of the most important fundamental principles. There is a previous lecture about what floor time is and what floor time is not that goes further into all of these and more fundamental principles. However, these are the most important when thinking about online teletherapy. First, emotionally meaningful relationships and experiences. This means that even online with teletherapy or other educational experiences, children need to develop and deepen meaningful relationships, and we need to make sure that these relationships and experiences are positive ones. Just because we're changing the modality of learning from in-person to online doesn't mean that we should be any less playful, silly, animated, positive, and enjoyable. Unfortunately, a lot of professionals are moving back towards a more skill and task-based intervention protocol, and that can lead to children having less fun, enjoying the process less, and thus getting less out of the learning experience, meaning we are not building as many connections in the brain as we would as if the child was enjoying it. Number 2, all experiences, all interventions need to involve thinking-based components. Thinking occurs when a child produces their own idea, word, solution, or response instead of using one taught by an adult. When children think, a strong internal process develops and generalization occurs. This means not teaching specific facts or skills. While many traditional therapies move in the direction of more adult-led interventions and learning experiences, we need to maintain that even if we are going to be leading at certain times, that we are including opportunities for a child to come up with their own ideas, be creative, problem solve, and think for themselves within any experience or activity they are having. And third, that this is a bottom-up approach. So Greenspan Floor Time is a bottom-up developmental approach that means we meet the child at their developmental level to help strengthen them from the ground up. What does this look like? Well, just because we have a 5-year-old who should be doing 5-year-old academics or social skills or have a 5-year-old language, that does not mean that we are going to focus on teaching that child the missing skills of a 5-year-old. One, it will be even harder to do that online because we will lose the child's attention much more rapidly than if we are in person and forcing them into something they didn't understand. However, online, we have to focus more on keeping their attention and interest, keeping things interesting and motivating. And in order to do that, we are going to be more effective by making sure the activity, the interaction, the experience itself is based on where the child is developmentally. If a child doesn't have a lot of language, we don't want to be using complex language. If a child isn't ready to do math, then we might play with shapes and blocks that just work on quantity concepts. If a child isn't ready to read on their own, maybe we do different drawing and visualization activities to help us understand the written word. This bottom-up principle not only applies to academic experiences, but especially social-emotional. And this means that if a child is not ready for having a conversation, then we should be focusing still on more gestural, physical, and limited verbal communication interaction with that child. This then begs the question, how do we support parents to understand and do this at home? A necessary component of the Greenspan Floor Time approach is supporting parents and helping them integrate this and implement this at home. And it is known scientifically that children need meaningful forms of sensory, motor, and emotional stimulation from caregivers to ensure the development of their brains. That means that children require reciprocal affective interactions with responsive and empathetic caregivers. This means they need to interact, have fun, play, but also make sure that caregivers are affective and responsive and empathetic during daily routines in life. It's not just during fun, playful experiences we need to make sure that caregivers are emotionally signaling and giving emotional feedback to their child, but we need to make sure they're doing it during daily routines and even conflict and stress. And I would say especially during conflict and stress. To do this, one way we can help caregivers is to coach them so we can be the voice in their head. I've done coaching sessions with caregivers through the internet where they will put an earpiece from their phone in, we'll have the computer on or a phone video camera on to help us see what's going on. In that way, there's not the distraction of my voice in the background. Many caregivers have opted for this because then also I'm not in the same room, and it can be even a more efficient and effective way of coaching a caregiver than sometimes being in person. The key ingredients with coaching caregivers are helping them remember that one of their primary roles is to counter and co-regulate. Counter-regulation is when we help a child become more stimulated or less stimulated based on the situation in front of us. Sometimes we're raising our affect to activate their social emotional awareness. Sometimes we're slowing things down and softening our affect to help calm them down and organize them. Sometimes we're providing them with more physical stimulus, with tickles and squishes and tossing them in the air to activate their sensory system. Sometimes we're slowing things down and going softer and slower with our physical activities to help calm and organize their body. Remember, this is the beginning of where we start to help engage with a child. And then we utilize these experiences to help them interact with us in a reciprocal form. Some of the activities that can help us with these types of interactions are sensory emotional activities. Things like spinning on office chairs, squishing with pillows or fast, slow tickles, blankets being used as swings. But we have to remember that it's not just about the physical sensation itself. It's about the social emotional interaction that is attached to the physical activity. This means that if we are tossing a child in the air, we only want to toss them in the air once or twice and then put them down so they can come back for more. They raise their hands, they run over to you, and now we have a nice interactive experience. They might even have to pull us down by the arm to get that other toss in the air. This can happen with tickles. If our hand is moving in slowly, the child might pull it in, or they might push it away. In either case, our job is to stimulate interaction utilizing tools of sensory experiences. The more we integrate the social emotional interaction with the sensory, the less that children need sensory stimulus over time. They're learning to control it and socially engage around it versus, unfortunately, what a lot of sensory professionals offer to children, which is self-involving and antisocial sensory activities. Unfortunately, if a child is digging through rice and beans or playing with shaving cream or bubbles, and they're not engaging and interacting with the adult, the child is experiencing the sensory world, but they're not developing true regulation. They're developing sensory regulation. But as we all know, regulation is both a sensory and especially an emotional process. So if the emotional component is not tied in, the child loses out on that experience and learning. Another option is when doing online teletherapy to have the caregivers become your virtual hands. This means you're still using your own words, face, and gestures on the screen, but you're going to have the caregiver act out what you're saying and doing. They're almost like your robot. The caregiver essentially, and I use this word lightly, becomes your tool, whereas you are still the primary focus of the social emotional exchange. That way the child continues to come back to you on the screen, interact, look, gesture, verbalize, point, etc. And the caregiver then carries out the actions that are defined by the game. Maybe they're a dancing robot, maybe they're a tickling robot, maybe they're a block stacking robot. So you can see how this can expand into a variety of activities a child might be interested in. Now, if you're more concerned with doing the therapy directly yourself, if a caregiver is not available, or if a caregiver is unwilling to participate, or if for billing purposes you have to be the primary focus of the activity and experience, then here are some suggestions for therapist-child interactions online. One of the main components that we're losing out of by moving things online from a sensory perspective is the ability to be in physical contact, i.e. touch. But there are many other sensory stimuli that we can provide a child through the internet and encourage them to receive within the home environment. And this may require us mobilizing our other sensory systems in a more exacerbated manner by accentuating our noises, songs, pictures, facial expressions, gestures, dance moves, etc., to capture the interest of the child, to have animated, playful responses to what the child does, and to make sure the child is truly having a fun time enjoying this process of interacting that may seem a little foreign to them at first. I like to think of myself sometimes as the character in a child's interactive game. I'm on one side of the screen, so what they do on their side then impacts what I do on my side. If they come near the screen, I might move back. If they gesture to the screen, I might move my body. And you can see how they start becoming both gesturally and verbally communicative with you through the screen can then still have an impact on the social exchange that occurs. A lot of people, when doing these types of therapy sessions, are focused on what activity can I do? And that is important because we need to maintain a child's interest. However, if we're so focused on the activity, we often lose focus on the importance of the social emotional exchange. And it is up to you, the adult, as the therapist or the caregiver, to make sure that these activities are still playful, fun, and silly. I just did an online video chat, and I was testing out some of these ideas while doing a collaborative storytelling exercise. I found that by bringing in a silly hat and having some props and materials around, it really helped keep their interest. I found that I had to make sure I was more animated and silly during the exchanges to make sure I got the same level of enthusiasm that I would have in real life. But one of the things I found that was fascinating is as we were doing the collaborative storytelling, they actually went and got their own toys and brought them into the play and helped create the story. While the toys were helpful, what really drove the story was mine and their participation in it, and the silliness of the ideas, the silliness of my responses, the silliness of their ideas, etc. It was the social emotional exchange that made the activity enjoyable and beneficial. I was able to ask more questions. I was able to help them become more creative by being more silly. Another alternative my father, Dr. Greenspan, described in some of his lectures is something called semi-structured Greenspan floor time. Again, a lot of people misunderstand what this means, but it is definitely an option, especially for these times. Semi-structured Greenspan floor time is defined by maintaining a child's emotional interest, i.e. their engagement, their creative thinking, and the interaction during an activity that the parent or professional initiates. The activity must still be based on the child's interests, developmental abilities, and needs. This means that we can bring in certain activities. We can initiate and suggest certain activities, but not ones that we want the child to do because it has some benefit for us achieving our goals or some academic benefit, but still they need to be activities that are based on a child's interests and activities that are developmentally appropriate. So using things like board games, obstacle courses, art projects, etc., are things we can suggest and make available during these sessions. But we still need to make sure that within whatever we provide, whatever we suggest, that the child is still being given the opportunity to be creative and figure out what they want to do within the activity. They should not be simply following instructions and directions, because then it is no longer semi-structured Greenspan floor time. It's just a structured activity. I'm not saying there isn't a time and a place for that, but kids can do puzzles, play board games, and have stories read to them at home. If we're going to be taking the time and putting in the energy to helping children achieve their developmental goals, there has to be an element of thinking and creativity and social interaction during that activity. This means that if we provide a board game, the child gets to make the rules or to make up a story about it. If we suggest doing an obstacle course, the child gets to come up with the components of the obstacle course, the steps that we're going to perform. If we put out art supplies, the child gets to scribble and draw and stencil based on their own creative process, not simply following a predetermined picture we want them to recreate. You can also both make a joint interactive comic strip. That means you draw a picture, they draw a picture. It can involve some of the same characters. I've done this with superheroes dozens of times, or other characters children like from movies and TV. For example, a child might draw a picture of their favorite superhero or character flying through the air, and then we can either draw a bad guy or maybe someone who's in distress, stuck in a burning building. All of a sudden, we have a story emerging in pictorial form. We can then use those pictures to describe it and talk about what might happen next. All of these activities, whether it be a board game, an obstacle course, and especially doing art, needs to be done interactively. This requires discussing what the child is making and doing, and sometimes it requires us to play dumb and help the child teach us how to play the game, draw or perform, or even in certain cases where a child does get self-involved because the activity is something they typically do in a more antisocial, isolated manner, then we may have to get playfully obstructive. However, I hope we know the child well enough to limit their access to the materials and toys and activities that encourage antisocial, self-involved behavior. When doing semi-structured Greenspan Floortime activities, think about open-ended common materials that you might find in a home. Play-Doh, silly putty, blocks, stuffed animals, markers, and crayons are some obvious options, but there may be others you can think of. And also avoid the use of small cars and figurines. Oftentimes, children utilize these toys in more self-involved and antisocial, isolated manners, and it will be very, very, very difficult, if not impossible, without being physically present, to help a child engage around them. As a result, these types of toys and activities should be avoided unless the child has already established the ability to interact around them. If they use them repetitively in an isolated way, they are going to continue to do so. And you being on one side of a screen and them being on another will not be sufficient to help break that pattern. If you were there in real life, then sure, you could be a little playfully obstructive and start reaching for their car, saying, I'm going to come get you, or start chasing their character, and you might get a response. Unfortunately, that will be less effective using teletherapy. One of the activities I've done with a number of children at various developmental levels, some children with limited to no language and some children with a lot of language, is reading a story together. Reading with children, not to children. This means acting out the book, using silly voices for the characters, exacerbating and accentuating silly, weird parts of a story. It also means finding developmentally appropriate questions or things to say that encourage and entice a child to respond to you. Simply going through the book by asking factual questions like what color is this, what's his name, what is he doing, are more concrete, rigid questions. And while it's okay to start with those questions are going to have a limited educational and therapeutic value. Remember, the goal here is to encourage thinking, not memorization. Identifying objects, colors, shapes, names is not our definition of thinking. It is simply memorizing and regurgitating a fact. However, more abstract questions like, oh, where's the character going? What's he going to do? Oh no, what's going to happen next? How do you think they feel about that? Oh, why did they do that? These types of questions with the right level of enthusiasm will get responses from many children. If they can't answer those questions, sometimes just posing a situation, so, oh no, I'm scared, I don't know what's going to happen next. And all of a sudden the child moves their hands to their face and looks scared too. guess what? Now we are reading with them. We got a gestural response, and with some children, we might be able to get a verbal response. Utilizing the same techniques, though, of making statements that can be playful, affirmative, and positive, as well as challenging statements that include emotional challenges, like, oh no, I'm scared, well, I don't know what's going to happen, are a good way to facilitate interaction, as well as some of the more traditional open-ended questions. Another option, especially for more verbal children, is creating an imaginative story together. This is something I did just yesterday with a few children. It was helpful that we actually started the story by utilizing a picture from a nature book. It was a very simple book that had a picture of animals that one might find kind of in the backyard or around in parks. So things like squirrels and woodpeckers. They even had a picture of a moose. So we picked a page from the book, and on it was a woodpecker. So we came up with a name, Woody, of course. And then progressively the story developed. At first I asked a question and they didn't respond, right? They wanted to read the book. That was kind of their expectation. But when I started the story about Woody and said, oh, okay, so Woody woke up and all of a sudden he realized no one was around. And he looked outside, all his friends and neighbors had disappeared. And then I looked at them and they looked like a little alarmed and curious. And I said, what happened? And they said, they all went on vacation without him. And we started this elaborate story. And then it turned out not only were his neighbors gone, but some of the other animals were still there. And they participated in the creative imaginative process that allowed me to ask questions. And the two of them went back and forth bouncing ideas about what was going to happen next. If I wanted to challenge them a little more, I added in new parts of the story. So all of a sudden they're talking about neighbors and vacation, and flipped the page, and on it was a big moose. And I said, uh-oh, it looks like Woody, in looking for all of his friends, woke up Mama Moose. And then they held their mouths, and I said, oh, how do you think Mama Moose feels? And they said, angry. I said, why? He said, because Mama Moose likes her sleep. And we had this entire back and forth. We got to talk about some of the emotional elements. We got to plan ahead and organize our thoughts. We got to be creative. We had to understand some of the social dynamics that Woody might be feeling as his friends disappeared. One of the other benefits was that during this process, it required taking turns and waiting, and it encouraged them to listen to one another and take in what was being said and process. So many of the things that we're working towards from a developmental perspective, and even within some of our individual therapeutic curriculums, can be addressed in these more creative, open-ended activities. What was also really nice was that as the story progressed, they actually brought in their own toys. They each grabbed one of their favorite stuffed animals and brought them into the story as new characters. You can see how this type of activity will be most successful and primarily applicable to children with language. And not just with language, but with functional pragmatic language. And this is why it is so important that this become our goal, not just memorizing and labeling using words, but instead working on true communication and social interaction, especially now that children are in a more organized and less overstimulating social environment. While at home, hopefully they're not around a dozen other kids. Hopefully they're not going to busy, chaotic places where they're not learning to get into these nice back and forth, rhythmic, reciprocal exchanges. Hopefully they're not feeling rushed or intruded upon, which makes them avoid or sometimes lash out around other children. So this time that we have can be used in many ways more beneficially than the time that we didn't have when children were spending 6, 8, 9 hours in a school program that was not designed to focus on their social emotional health. And it is up to us as professionals and the children's parents to understand that while these are very uncertain, trying, and stressful times, there are certain positives that can come out of it if we use this time wisely. And that's what I would encourage us as professionals and every parent I talk to do. And we understand that energy and emotional fortitude is a limited commodity these days, but we also understand that parents who are able to provide their children with this level of feedback and attention and involvement will be investing this energy and be getting a big return in the long run. Thank you all for listening, and if you'd like more information, free lectures, workshops, please go to stanleygreenspan.com and access a variety of Greenspan Floortime materials. For those of you who would like online or in-person parent coaching, intensive therapy programs and services, please contact us at the Floortime Center.